Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, what will essentially happen in the world of government is that in the long run, men will now need priority funding. And then the vicious cycle of priority funding will continue to just keep going. Women, men, women, men, and ultimately, more problems are created rather than solved. Before I move on to my issues in this debate, a couple of rebuttals against the immediate previous speaker, also rebutting their entire bench in general, because they had several themes which weren't really tied together properly. On the first, which is ultimately a straw man against Nate's case, we think that the right of these investors, and we think that these investors already judge these projects based on the different outcomes Therese already talked about. Not only should gender not be a part of those variables or standards in which these investors judge things, we think that they judge things on the basis of so many other reasons which Therese talked about, such as outcome and the potential for that research to ultimately be successful. Secondly, we think that when he talked about how women back then are faced these structural limitations, we think that Nate's POI was already enough. We talked about how we already said sorry for these things, and they're ultimately already recognizing these things as an archaic characterization. Under the idea that Nate also gave you matter and other examples as to how they're not. Let me give you more. A lot of CSV, or creating shared value research, are primarily now being published in international journals, and a lot of them are written by women. And we think that the problem they're trying to pose by prioritizing their funding is ultimately not the solution to push the empowerment, which we think is already happening. But even if it's not happening, you backtrack the movement which primarily tried to combat the structural limitations both sides were already trying to solve. It ultimately becomes worse. Now let's move on to my issues, right? I have two issues in this debate. My first issue is gender as a standard for priority funding, should it be? And secondly, the consequence of priority, Nate's case, something which ultimately was not responded to. Benjo.
If you're saying that these investors already judged the merit or the research based on merit, are you saying that with one specific change of gender who made it will change the mindset of an investor not accepting the merit of that project?
We think that these investors judge it on many reasons, not just outcome, but primarily it's obviously outcome. But the harm on your side is that if you force them to judge it on the basis of gender, not only do you shortchange the reputation of that woman because you're saying just because she's a woman, she should get priority funding, we think it's also harmful to the man who might be just as capable or even more capable of achieving potential scientific research. On to the first layer of this issue, right? This debate is not about removing or banning women's funding in entirety. This debate is about why women will receive priority and by virtue even more funding on the primary basis of her gender and not the other variables which Therese already outlined. There were three, right? First is on a large opportunity to be accrued. Second is the potential of that research, meaning the outcome. And lastly is on the capability of that researcher to be able to achieve the outcome they sought of in the beginning. And these are the reasons as to why investors or people fund these things to begin with, and gender has no role there. Why? We think that when you achieve the outcome, we think that in addition to this, there's ultimately a principled injustice that happens against male researchers. Even if they're trying to say that for the past, they've received the perks of research and they had priority, we think the solution, if you want to make the world a better place and research to be better, isn't to strip them of that funding, which is precisely the consequence of priority, which Nate ultimately talked about. Let me talk to you about two scenarios, right? In golf, you have a male and female, both equally capable of having an outcome and equally capable of being able to have successful research. They're going to fund the female. On our side of the house, just so it's clear, we think that if you have a male and female, both with equal chance of success, we are ultimately going to give them the respective funding which each project needs. It really depends, right? It depends on the outcome or need of the project. But if push comes to shove, we're going to tell them we're going to give them ultimately equal funding if need be, right? And we think that's ultimately important because we don't want to skew the market, which Nate talked about, and ultimately in his thing. Now the conclusion to this first issue is that successful women who were previously outliers are now becoming the rule. And And when you now prioritize women's funding on the basis for gender, you backtrack the entire progress we have already made. And we think that on our side of the house, these structural limitations are best challenged, not when you create an entirely new problem of not funding men and ultimately skewing their research just because in the past they were successful. On principle, it's unfair to them, and in pragmatic, I'll talk about the second issue, on the idea of the consequence of priority. We think that Nate's case in the matter he gave was ultimately not responded. And we think that even if a man's project isn't going to automatically fail when you don't give him funding or you don't give him funding, we think that it's still principally unjust to prevent him from receiving what is due to him on the basis of another woman having a similar project, and it just so happens that she is a woman. And this ties back to the standards Therese talked about on how it's ultimately outcome-based, and it's not just outcome-based, based on other things, and ultimately not gender. So we think the best case of our side is that you don't skew the market, and you don't condemn men's research to potentially fail when now you strip them of that funding. Because you can't essentially assume that it might fail or it might not fail. We're not entirely sure because each project should be taken on a case-to-case basis. What we do stand for is that you shouldn't give women priority primarily because of the consequences of priority which Nate ultimately talked about. So what have we exclusively talked to you on our side of the house? We gave you a really clear flash and we talked about how ultimately gender should not be a standard in determining priority funding. We talked about how it's ultimately a terrible idea, how you skew markets, and ultimately it does more harm than good. So with all these reasons and more, we proudly take this debate. Thank you.